Welcome back to the Crypto Intellect, the channel where we break down the biggest crypto stories, separate facts from speculation, and uncover the signals that many investors completely miss. Today's story is one that has exploded across the XRP community because a newly surfaced development has many people asking whether the White House is quietly preparing the financial infrastructure for something much bigger involving Ripple and XRP. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's make something clear right away. What reportedly leaked is not a government purchase order for XRP, and there is no verified evidence that the White House has announced plans to buy XRP directly. What has surfaced instead is a series of developments that appear to fit together in a very interesting pattern. A major DTCC-related infrastructure move, Ripple Prime gaining unprecedented clearing access, a billion-dollar acquisition, and a White House official publicly disclosing personal XRP holdings. Separately, each event is significant. Together, they raise questions that deserve serious discussion. That is exactly what we are going to analyze today, because sometimes the biggest market stories are not found in one headline but in how multiple pieces of information begin connecting over time. The first piece of this puzzle centers around what many people are calling the leaked DTCC plan. The reason this story has gained so much attention is because the documents being discussed reportedly focus on integrating crypto-native financial firms into America's existing clearing infrastructure instead of keeping digital assets separated from traditional finance. That distinction matters because institutional adoption has always depended on infrastructure more than headlines. Markets do not transform simply because people make predictions on social media. They transform when the plumbing underneath the financial system changes. According to the information being analyzed, Ripple Prime moved into a position unlike any previous crypto-linked provider after Ripple completed its approximately $1.25 billion acquisition of Hidden Road. Instead of remaining just another crypto company operating on the outside, Ripple suddenly became connected to one of the most important layers of institutional finance. That is why experienced market participants are paying attention. This conversation is not about hype. It is about whether financial infrastructure is quietly evolving before most retail investors fully recognize what is happening. Now here is where things become even more interesting. Most people only read the headline and immediately assume someone is talking about the government secretly buying XRP. That is not what the available information actually suggests. Instead, what has people talking is that the documents reportedly describe a production-level financial framework rather than a small pilot program. In other words, this is not simply a test environment where companies experiment with blockchain technology. The discussion revolves around brokerage services, exchange capabilities, custody solutions, and clearing operations functioning together under one integrated institutional structure rather than depending on several disconnected intermediaries. If that model continues expanding, it represents something much larger than another blockchain proof of concept. It suggests that regulators and financial institutions may be moving closer to connecting digital asset infrastructure with the existing financial system. That possibility is why investors continue watching every Ripple-related development so closely. Infrastructure changes usually happen quietly, long before the broader market fully understands their long-term implications. To understand why everyone keeps mentioning the DTCC, you first need to understand what it actually does. The Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation is essentially one of the most important organizations supporting the United States financial markets. Every day, when investors buy or sell stocks, bonds, and many other financial instruments, someone has to ensure that the assets and the cash actually reach the correct parties. That process is known as clearing and settlement, and the DTCC sits at the center of that enormous operation. We are not talking about millions or even billions of dollars. We are talking about transactions measured in quadrillions of dollars every year. That level of activity makes the organization one of the most critical components of America's financial infrastructure. Whenever a company gains deeper integration with systems connected to this environment, institutional investors naturally begin paying closer attention. It does not automatically mean XRP adoption is guaranteed, but it certainly explains why these developments are creating so much discussion across both crypto communities and traditional financial circles. According to the reports circulating throughout the industry, Ripple Prime was added to the DTCC's NSCC participant directory following Ripple's acquisition of Hidden Road. That single development immediately attracted attention because many analysts viewed it as the first time a crypto-linked service provider achieved this specific level of direct access within U.S. clearing operations. Again, it is important to stay grounded in facts rather than speculation. Direct participation in clearing infrastructure is not the same thing as announcing XRP as a national settlement asset. However, institutional infrastructure often develops step by step rather than through dramatic announcements. Financial markets typically reward companies that establish trusted operational relationships before larger adoption occurs. Whether this eventually benefits XRP remains uncertain, but the market understands that infrastructure matters. Investors who ignore infrastructure sometimes miss the earliest stages of major financial shifts because they focus only on price movements instead of the systems quietly being built behind the scenes. Before we continue, remember that nothing discussed in today's video should be interpreted as financial advice. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Every investor should conduct independent research, evaluate multiple sources, and understand the risks involved before making financial decisions. Markets remain unpredictable, and even the strongest narratives can change quickly when new information becomes available. That being said, understanding institutional developments is an important part of responsible investing because the largest market participants rarely move without first building the necessary infrastructure. Retail investors often notice the headlines after institutions have already spent months or even years preparing. That is one reason so many experienced analysts spend their time studying filings, infrastructure announcements, acquisitions, and regulatory developments rather than focusing exclusively on daily price charts. Long-term trends usually begin with quiet structural changes before they appear in market valuations. Now comes another piece of the story that many viewers found especially surprising. Reports indicate that a special assistant to the president disclosed personal XRP holdings as part of official financial disclosures. Naturally, this sparked enormous debate across the crypto community. Some immediately interpreted the disclosure as evidence that government insiders know something the public does not. Others argued that personal investments should never be confused with official government policy. The reality is much more balanced. Public officials are often required to disclose certain financial interests precisely so that transparency exists. A disclosure does not automatically indicate endorsement, policy direction, or future government action. However, when that disclosure appears around the same time as major infrastructure developments involving Ripple, it naturally attracts additional public attention. Whether those events are connected or entirely unrelated remains uncertain, but it certainly explains why investors have started looking more closely at the broader picture instead of focusing on isolated headlines. If you had already heard about Ripple Prime's reported DTCC clearing access before watching this video, let us know in the comments because many investors are only discovering this information now. And if you enjoy balanced crypto analysis that focuses on facts, infrastructure, regulation, and long-term institutional trends instead of emotional hype, make sure you subscribe to the Crypto Intellect and turn on notifications so you never miss another update. Every single week, new developments emerge that could reshape how digital assets integrate into the financial system. And staying informed is becoming more important than ever. The crypto market moves incredibly fast, but infrastructure stories often move quietly. By the time mainstream media begins covering them extensively, institutional positioning may already be well underway. That is exactly why conversations like today's matter, even when there are still unanswered questions surrounding the broader narrative. Another reason this discussion has become so important is because Ripple has consistently positioned itself as a company focused on enterprise financial infrastructure rather than consumer speculation. For years, Ripple executives have emphasized payments, liquidity solutions, institutional partnerships, and regulatory engagement instead of promoting unrealistic overnight price predictions. Whether someone supports XRP or not, it is difficult to ignore the company's long-term strategy. Rather than attempting to replace every part of the financial system immediately, Ripple has repeatedly focused on solving specific institutional problems involving cross-border settlement, liquidity efficiency, and financial connectivity. If infrastructure organizations become increasingly comfortable working alongside crypto-native firms, companies with existing enterprise relationships may naturally benefit. That possibility is one reason investors continue analyzing every major Ripple announcement, acquisition, and institutional partnership with such intense interest. The Hidden Road acquisition also deserves far more attention than it has received. Billion-dollar acquisitions are not made casually, especially within financial markets where regulatory compliance and operational integration require enormous planning. Hidden Road already served institutional clients across multiple financial sectors, and bringing that business under Ripple's umbrella expanded Ripple's reach well beyond traditional crypto discussions. When investors combine that acquisition with clearing-related developments and increasing institutional conversations surrounding blockchain technology, they begin asking whether Ripple is preparing for a much larger role within global financial infrastructure. Nobody can answer that question with certainty today, but the direction of travel appears different from where the company stood only a few years ago. Infrastructure expansion usually occurs gradually, and successful financial companies often spend years building capabilities before the broader market recognizes their strategic positioning. One of the biggest mistakes investors make is assuming every important financial development arrives with a dramatic press conference. History often shows the opposite. Banking infrastructure, payment systems, securities markets, and settlement networks typically evolve through technical integrations, regulatory approvals, acquisitions, and operational partnerships that receive relatively little mainstream attention at the time. Months or even years later, people suddenly realize those quiet developments fundamentally changed how financial markets operate. That possibility is exactly why discussions surrounding Ripple Prime continue attracting so much attention. Even if no immediate impact appears on XRP's price, infrastructure improvements can create optionality for future growth. Institutional investors frequently evaluate infrastructure readiness long before allocating significant capital, and understanding those preparations can sometimes provide valuable context for long-term market analysis. Of course, skepticism remains healthy, and every responsible investor should separate confirmed facts from social media speculation. There is currently no verified evidence proving that the White House has secretly decided to purchase XRP or designate it as an official reserve asset based on the information discussed today. Headlines designed to generate excitement often oversimplify much more complicated institutional developments. The smarter approach is to analyze verified events individually while considering whether broader patterns might be emerging. Ripple's infrastructure expansion, institutional acquisitions, reported DTCC-related developments, and public disclosures all exist within the public conversation. Whether they ultimately converge into something transformational remains an open question. Investors should remain curious without becoming emotionally attached to any single narrative because financial markets have a habit of surprising both optimists and skeptics alike. Meanwhile, institutional adoption of digital assets continues expanding across multiple areas of finance. Stablecoins, tokenized securities, blockchain settlement solutions, and digital asset custody services have all attracted growing interest from banks, asset managers, and financial technology firms over recent years. This broader environment provides important context for Ripple's strategic positioning. Even if one specific rumor eventually proves inaccurate, the overall direction of institutional engagement with blockchain technology appears significantly stronger than it was only a few years ago. Governments, regulators, and financial institutions are increasingly exploring how digital infrastructure can coexist with existing financial systems rather than viewing blockchain as something operating entirely outside traditional finance. That shift alone represents a major evolution in how digital assets are being perceived throughout institutional markets. For XRP holders, the biggest takeaway is probably not today's headline itself, but the broader pattern developing underneath the surface. Markets often reward patience when investors focus on structural progress instead of reacting emotionally to every rumor or short-term price movement. Infrastructure announcements rarely create immediate price explosions, but they can gradually strengthen long-term adoption narratives if additional developments continue supporting them over time. Whether Ripple ultimately becomes a central institutional infrastructure provider will depend on regulation, execution, competition, and continued industry adoption. Those variables remain uncertain, but the conversation has clearly evolved beyond simply asking whether blockchain technology has a future. Increasingly, the discussion focuses on which companies will help build that future. As we wrap up today's analysis, remember that the most valuable skill any investor can develop is the ability to distinguish between sensational headlines and meaningful structural developments. The headline claiming that the White House has a secret plan to buy XRP certainly grabs attention, but the deeper story involves institutional infrastructure, clearing access, strategic acquisitions, and growing connections between traditional finance and digital assets. Those developments deserve careful analysis because they could influence the future direction of the industry, regardless of whether every rumor proves accurate. Continue following the evidence, question every assumption, and avoid making investment decisions based solely on excitement or fear. Thank you for spending your time with us here on the Crypto Intellect. If you found this breakdown valuable, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with other XRP supporters who want thoughtful analysis instead of empty hype. We'll continue tracking every major Ripple, XRP, and institutional crypto development so you stay informed as this story continues to unfold.